The sun hung low over the village of Umwaka, casting golden rays over the narrow footpaths that wound through clusters of mud houses and palm trees. The village, deeply rooted in Catholic traditions, was a place where faith shaped destinies, where mothers prayed fervently for their sons to become priests, believing it was the highest honor a family could attain. Among these mothers was Agnes, a woman whose faith was as unshakable as the ancient Iroko tree standing in the center of the village square. She had one son, Michael, and she had dedicated her entire life to ensuring he would one day wear the white cassock and bring pride to her name. Mama Father, the mere thought of people calling her by that title filled her with indescribable joy. She had suffered too much in life, enduring the shame of a husband who had left her struggling to raise Michael alone. To her, making Michael a priest was not just about serving God. It was about redeeming her name, silencing those who had looked down on her. Michael, however, had other dreams. At 16, he wanted to be many things: a teacher, a businessman, even a traveler who explored places beyond Umwaka. But those dreams did not matter. His mother had already decided his path. "You must go to the seminary," Agnes told him one evening, her voice firm as she pounded cassava in a wooden mortar. "God has called you. I have prayed about it. This is the only way for you to bring blessings to this family." Michael sat on the bench outside their small hut, staring at the sky. He wanted to protest, to tell her that the call she spoke of was hers, not his. But he knew better. In Umwaka, arguing with one's mother about priesthood was seen as resisting God's will. The following year, Michael found himself behind the towering gates of St. Peter's Seminary. The walls were high, the air thick with the scent of burning candles and aged books. Here, young boys were molded into men of God, stripped of worldly desires, and trained to live lives of service and holiness. At first, he resisted, feeling trapped in a life he did not choose. But over time, he adapted. He learned the prayers, the sermons, and the sacred rituals. He perfected the art of humility, wearing a serene smile as he spoke of God's love. He became everything his mother had dreamed of. By the time he was ordained, Father Michael was adored by the congregation. Women knelt before him, seeking his blessings. Men looked up to him as a beacon of righteousness. No one questioned his devotion, but beneath the cassock, behind the doors of the parish house, Michael carried a burden, one that could shake the very foundation of the church. Sophia had grown up in the church. She was the daughter of one of the parish leaders, a man who took pride in his family's close relationship with the priest. From a young age, Sophia's parents had insisted she serve at the parish house, cooking, washing, and ensuring that the revered Father Michael was well taken care of. "Take this to the Father," her mother would say, handing her a pot of steaming soup. "Make sure he eats well. A man of God must be strong." Sophia obeyed, never questioning why she was always the one sent. Over time, her presence at the parish house became routine. She would clean his space, prepare his meals, and sometimes sit quietly as he read his Bible. It was during one of these evenings that the boundaries blurred. It started with long conversations, Father Michael sharing stories of his struggles, Sophia listening with admiration. Then came the lingering glances, the accidental touches. One night, the silence between them grew too heavy. The storm outside raged as Sophia stood to leave, but Michael reached for her hand. She should have pulled away, but she didn't. What happened next was a moment neither of them could take back. Sophia left the parish house that night with a heart burdened by guilt, but also by something else, an emotion she could not name. Weeks passed, and the signs began to show. The missed cycle, the unusual sickness, the heaviness in her chest. Sophia was pregnant. Across the village, another storm was brewing. Evelyn sat in her room, staring at the small bundle of cloth in her hands, the cloth that had once wrapped the confirmation gift she had received from Father Michael. She traced the patterns absent-mindedly, her mind a battlefield of emotions. She had never expected this to happen. When she first confided in Father Michael about her marital struggles, it was out of desperation. Her husband, Henry, was a good man, kind, hardworking, But there was something missing. The warmth, the closeness that made a marriage whole. Father Michael had listened, offering words of comfort, his voice steady and reassuring. And then, like a slow-burning fire, their interactions became something more. It was never planned, never intended. But intentions no longer mattered. Now, she was carrying a child that was not her husband's. And what she did not know was that Henry, her loving, devoted husband, was aware of a secret she had yet to uncover. Henry was not like other men. He had spent years hiding a truth that could shake their home to its foundation. He had known, even before they got married, that he could never father a child. A condition he had kept to himself, believing that love would be enough. So when Evelyn announced she was expecting, Henry's world shattered, because he knew, without a doubt, that the child was not his. In the heart of the village, beneath the towering steeple of St. Peter's Catholic Church, Father Michael stood before the altar, his voice steady as he delivered the sermon. The congregation listened in reverence, hanging on to every word. No one knew that behind his calm exterior, his world was unraveling. 2 women, 2 pregnancies, a secret that, if revealed, could bring down everything he had built. The morning after Sunday Mass, Father Michael sat in his office at the parish house, hands clasped, staring at the crucifix on the wall. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Sophia had not spoken to him since she discovered her condition. She had started avoiding him, her once cheerful presence now replaced with uneasy glances and hurried steps whenever they crossed paths. He knew she was terrified. So was he. And then there was Evelyn. She had always been composed, always carried herself with the grace of a devoted wife. But yesterday, as she left the church, he had noticed the distant look in her eyes, the way she clutched her rosary too tightly. Michael felt the walls closing in. For years, he had played his role perfectly, standing as a symbol of righteousness, blessing the people, listening to their confessions, and praying over their troubles. But now, he was the one drowning in sin, carrying a secret too heavy to bear. He exhaled sharply and rose to his feet. He needed to act before everything collapsed. Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach. She had not yet told her parents, and the thought alone made her stomach churn. Her father was a strict man, deeply devoted to the church, a leader who commanded respect among the congregation. If he found out that she was pregnant, worse, that the father of her child was the priest he so admired, his fury would be unimaginable. And her mother, the woman who had constantly reminded her that a virtuous daughter never brought shame to her home. Tears welled in her eyes. What was she going to do? A knock on the door startled her. "Come in," she said softly, quickly wiping her tears. Her mother entered, holding a bowl of soup. "You have not been eating well," she observed. "Are you feeling sick?" Sophia shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "Just tired." Her mother studied her face, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "I hope you're not hiding anything from me." Sophia's heart pounded. She could not tell her, not yet. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in the living room of her home, watching as her husband, Henry, prepared to leave for work. She had expected him to be excited about the pregnancy, to lift her in joy like other husbands did when their wives announced such news. But instead, his reaction had been cold. He had barely spoken about it. He had simply nodded and muttered, "That's good, something was wrong." "Henry," she called gently. He turned, adjusting his wristwatch. "Yes?" "Are you not happy about the baby?" she asked carefully. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I'm just surprised." Evelyn frowned. "Surprised?" Henry met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Evelyn, are you sure the child is mine?" The words struck her like a slap. She felt her breath hitch, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. What do you mean?" she stammered. Henry exhaled slowly. "I need you to be honest with me." Panic surged through her. Did he know? Had he suspected? She forced a shaky laugh. "Henry, how can you ask me that? Of course the baby is yours." His lips pressed into a thin line. "All right," he said simply. Then, without another word, he grabbed his briefcase and walked out the door. Evelyn remained frozen in place, her mind spinning. Something told her that Henry knew more than he was letting on. That evening, Father Michael received a message from Evelyn. "We need to talk." He closed his eyes. He had known this moment was coming. The weight of his choices was becoming unbearable. Secrets could only stay buried for so long, and his were beginning to surface. Father Michael sat in the dimly lit office of the parish house, Evelyn's message still glowing on the screen of his phone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he debated whether to respond. He had managed to keep up the facade for years, balancing the weight of his sins while maintaining his image. But now, everything was slipping through his fingers. He took a deep breath and typed a response. "Come to the parish house after evening prayers." As soon as he sent it, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. He needed to think. He needed a way out, but was there truly an escape from this? Sophia's parents sat in the living room that night, engaged in quiet conversation. Her father, Patrick, was discussing church matters with his wife, when he suddenly paused, his brow furrowing. "Have you noticed Sophia lately?" he asked. His wife, Teresa, looked up. "What about her?" Patrick rested his chin on his hand. "She's been distant, and she's looking pale. I hope she's not hiding something from us," Teresa scoffed. "She's just tired. All the running around for the church, the chores at the parish house." "That's another thing," Patrick interrupted. "She spends too much time there. I sent her because I trust Father Michael, but—" His voice trailed off, as if his own thoughts unsettled him. Teresa waved a hand dismissively. "What are you suggesting? That Father Michael is anything less than holy?" She laughed. "Please, my husband, the man is a servant of God." Patrick didn't argue further, but the unease in his heart refused to settle. Later that night, Evelyn arrived at the parish house, draped in a simple shawl. She kept her head low as she slipped inside, careful not to attract attention. Father Michael was waiting for her in his office, his expression unreadable. "You said we needed to talk," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Evelyn hesitated before perching on the chair across from him. She clasped her hands together, struggling to find the right words. "Henry suspects something," she finally said. Michael stiffened. "What do you mean?" "He asked if the child is his," she whispered, her voice trembling. A heavy silence stretched between them. Michael swallowed hard. "What did you say?" "I told him it was," she said quickly. "But Michael? I don't think he believes me. He's acting strange, distant." Michael exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "We have to be careful. If he finds out the truth—" "Then what?" Evelyn cut in. "He won't just leave me, Michael. He will expose us. And then what will happen to you?" Michael had no answer. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, as if the walls were closing in on her. "What do we do?" she whispered. Michael stood pacing the room. He had spent years crafting his image, years perfecting his reputation. He could not let one mistake destroy everything. "We stay calm," he said finally. "Henry has no proof. As long as we deny it, nothing changes." Evelyn nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. Sophia lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She had tried to pray, tried to find solace in the same faith that had been instilled in her since childhood. But how could she? She was carrying a child that should not exist. A secret that, if revealed, would shatter her family. And yet, deep down, another fear gnawed at her. Father Michael had not once asked how she was doing, had not reached out since that night. Had she been nothing more than a mistake to him? Tears slipped down her cheeks. Tomorrow she would have to make a decision. She could no longer carry this. Father Michael lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his room. His mind raced through possible ways to erase the looming disaster before him. The fear of exposure gnawed at his soul, and for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. Then, an idea struck him. He sat up abruptly, recalling a conversation he had nearly forgotten. A few months ago, a young man in the church, Daniel, had come to him seeking guidance on marriage. "Father, I need a good woman," Daniel had said. "A devoted Catholic, someone pure and well-mannered. I want to build a holy home." At the time, Michael had brushed it aside, but now it felt like divine intervention. Without wasting time, he reached for his phone and dialed Daniel's number. Sophia was in her room the next morning when her mother knocked and entered. "You have a visitor," her mother said, smiling. "Father Michael wants to see you." Sophia's heart pounded. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks. Was he finally ready to acknowledge her? She quickly adjusted her dress and hurried to the sitting room, where she found Father Michael seated beside a young man she recognized, Daniel. Michael smiled warmly. "Sophia, come, sit." Sophia hesitated before taking a seat across from them. "I have been praying for you," Michael began, his tone calm and reassuring. "I know you have been feeling troubled, but God has a plan for you." Sophia swallowed hard. What was he trying to say? Michael turned to Daniel. "You remember Daniel? A devoted brother in our church, a man of faith. He has been seeking a good woman to be his wife, and as your spiritual father, I have prayed about this. I believe you both are meant to walk this journey together." Sophia's breath hitched. "Marriage?" Daniel smiled politely. "I've admired your devotion for a long time, Sophia. Father Michael speaks highly of you. I would be honored if we could get to know each other." Sophia's throat went dry. She darted a glance at Michael, but his face remained unreadable. She wanted to scream, to say, "No." But how could she refuse when the entire church saw Michael as a man of wisdom? If she opposed him, wouldn't it seem like she was rejecting God's will? Her mother clasped her hands in excitement. "Oh, Sophia, this is wonderful news." Sophia felt trapped, but she nodded weakly, forcing a small smile. "Thank you, I need time to think." Michael reached out and gently patted her shoulder. "Of course, but I know you'll make the right choice." Sophia could barely breathe. She understood exactly what this was, Michael's way of silencing her, and she was powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, Evelyn's home was filled with an unusual sense of peace. Her husband, Henry, had accepted the pregnancy without question. "God has answered our prayers," he said one evening as he massaged Evelyn's feet. "I knew he would never fail us." Evelyn smiled weakly. She still couldn't understand how Henry had so easily accepted the child, but she didn't dare question it. As long as he believed in the miracle, she was safe. And as long as Michael still wanted her, she would continue to meet him in secret. Weeks passed, and Sophia eventually agreed to marry Daniel. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by the entire congregation. Her father, Patrick, beamed with pride, grateful that his daughter had been chosen by the church for such a blessed union. But inside, Sophia felt nothing but numbness. Even as she stood before the altar in her white gown, exchanging vows with Daniel, her mind drifted elsewhere, to the man who had put her in this situation, to the child growing inside her that would now be passed off as Daniel's, to the nights she knew she would still spend in secret, answering Michael's call. And so, life moved on. Evelyn gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, whom Henry adored, never suspecting the truth. Sophia settled into marriage with Daniel, who treated her with love and kindness. But behind closed doors, nothing had changed. Father Michael still had them both, and the secret burden they all carried remained buried beneath the perfect image of holiness, for now. Father Michael stood at the pulpit one Sunday morning, delivering a sermon on purity and righteousness. His voice carried conviction, his words stirring the hearts of the congregation. Yet beneath the cassock and the air of holiness, he knew he was a man drowning in his own sins. From the first pew, Sophia sat beside her husband Daniel, clutching their newborn daughter, whom everyone believed was Daniel's child. Her face remained calm, but inside, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Evelyn, seated further back with Henry and their son, listened with the same conflicted heart. Henry had never been happier, and she couldn't bring herself to shatter his joy. Both women, bound by the same man's deception, shared secret glances across the church, glances filled with unspoken truths. Michael avoided their eyes. He knew the weight of their silent judgment, but he also knew he had them exactly where he wanted them. Or so he thought. Sophia's marriage was peaceful, at least on the surface. Daniel was a good man, kind and deeply devoted to his faith. He adored their child, never questioning a thing. But at night, when Sophia lay beside him, guilt suffocated her. Michael still summoned her, just as he did Evelyn, and she still obeyed. Every time she convinced herself to stop, to break free, she remembered the power he held over her. He had saved her from disgrace. He had given her a way out, And now she was bound to him in ways even marriage could not break. Evelyn, too, found herself trapped in a similar web. She had hoped that after childbirth, she would feel distant from Michael, that motherhood would erase her need for him. But instead, the secrecy thrilled her, the deception fueling a fire she couldn't explain. Henry remained the devoted husband, oblivious to the betrayal in his home. And Evelyn, despite the love she saw in her husband's eyes, continued sneaking into Michael's arms. Months passed. The lives they had built remained steady, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Sophia grew colder toward Daniel. Unable to fake happiness forever, she could see the confusion in his eyes, the silent pain of a man who felt his wife slipping away but didn't know why. Evelyn, too, began to struggle. The guilt weighed heavier now. The more Henry celebrated their son, the more she wondered if she was playing with fire. And then, something happened that none of them expected. One evening, as Sophia returned from a visit to her parents, she found Daniel sitting alone in the living room, staring at the floor. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice unusually quiet. Sophia's heart pounded. "What is it?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Sophia froze. Daniel studied her face. "You've been distant, Sophia. I try to understand, but something doesn't feel right. I love you, but I feel like I don't know you anymore." Sophia felt her throat close up. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to break free. But how could she? How could she tell him that the man he revered, the priest who had united them, was the very reason their marriage was built on a lie? So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She lied. "There's nothing wrong," she whispered, forcing a smile. "I guess I've just been tired." Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. But deep down, Sophia knew he wasn't convinced. And that terrified her. Evelyn's secret, too, was beginning to slip. One night, as she returned from one of her clandestine meetings with Michael, she found Henry waiting for her in the bedroom, his arms crossed. "Where were you?" he asked. Evelyn's heart stopped. I went to see a friend." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "Which friend?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "Margaret." A heavy silence settled between them before Henry finally said, "Okay." But as he turned away and lay down, Evelyn knew. He didn't believe her, and for the first time she felt real fear. Because if Henry ever found out the truth, everything would fall apart. Henry had always been a patient man, but something about Evelyn's behavior in recent months had unsettled him. He couldn't explain it, but a deep, gnawing feeling told him something wasn't right. So when a business opportunity arose, requiring him to travel for 3 months, he took it without hesitation. It wasn't just about work. It was a chance to clear his mind, to distance himself from the nagging doubts that had begun creeping into his marriage. Evelyn, on the other hand, was devastated by his departure. For the first time since their secret affair began, she felt the weight of Henry's absence. Michael was still there, of course, but something about sneaking around without the fear of her husband discovering them made the affair less thrilling. And then there was a new problem. 2 months after Henry left, Evelyn started feeling off. Fatigue, nausea, an odd sensitivity to smells. At first, she brushed it aside, assuming it was just stress, but as the weeks passed, she couldn't deny the truth. She was pregnant. Panic gripped her. Henry had been gone for over a month before the symptoms started, and she knew without a doubt that the child belonged to Michael. But how would she explain this? She counted the days, prayed for a miracle, even considered traveling to her sister's for a while to avoid suspicion. But before she could figure out a plan, Henry returned. Henry's homecoming was different this time. Evelyn had expected him to be filled with longing, to rush into her arms like before. But instead, he was distant, reserved. She tried everything, cooking his favorite meals, dressing beautifully, even pretending to be overly affectionate. But no matter what she did, he resisted intimacy with her. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion, but as the days turned into weeks, his rejection became deliberate. And then, something happened that shattered her composure completely. One evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse, Henry walked in. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied her reflection. "You've gained weight," he remarked. Evelyn's breath caught. I have." Henry stepped closer, his gaze sharp. You've also been nauseous every morning, and you avoid certain foods you used to love. Her hands trembled. Henry's voice was cold when he asked, Are you pregnant, Evelyn? Silence. Evelyn opened her mouth, desperate to come up with a lie, but nothing came. Henry exhaled, shaking his head. I already suspected something before I left. That's why I didn't touch you when I returned. I wanted to be sure. Evelyn's entire world crumbled. Henry clenched his jaw. Who is responsible? Evelyn backed away, shaking her head. Henry, please. Who? His voice thundered through the room. Tears streamed down her face. She had run out of options. And so, with a broken whisper, she said, Father Michael. The silence that followed was suffocating. Henry's hands balled into fists. His face contorted with so much rage that, for a second, Evelyn thought he would strike her. But instead, he turned and stormed out of the house. Meanwhile, Sophia's marriage had also started unraveling. Daniel, like Henry, had become increasingly distant. He no longer smiled as much, no longer touched her with the same warmth. Sophia could feel it. He knew something was wrong. Then, one evening, just as Henry was learning the truth about Evelyn, Daniel confronted Sophia. Sophia, your daughter doesn't resemble either of us and none of our family members. Any explanation to that? Sophia's heart nearly stopped. She had spent months trying to keep up the charade, but now the walls were closing in. Tears welled in her eyes. Daniel, stop, please. He stepped back, shaking his head. I trusted you. I believed you were the wife God chose for me. And now? His voice cracked. Now I feel like I've been living a lie. Sophia collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. She knew it was over. Who? Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if that would make the moment disappear. But when she finally whispered, Father Michael, the devastation on Daniel's face made her wish she had never spoken. He turned and walked away. The confrontation happened at dawn. Michael was in his chambers when the door burst open. Henry and Daniel stormed in, their faces filled with fury. Michael had expected this day to come, but he had never imagined it would feel this terrifying. You lied to us, Daniel spat. You betrayed everything you preached. Henry's fists were clenched. You destroyed my home, my wife, my trust. Michael tried to speak, to come up with an excuse, but for the first time, words failed him. There was nothing left to say. The scandal erupted within hours. By midday, the entire town knew. The church leaders were in shock, the congregation divided between anger and disbelief. Michael was immediately stripped of his position. The bishop released a public statement, condemning his actions. Evelyn's marriage was beyond repair. Henry left, vowing never to return. Daniel, though heartbroken, asked Sophia to pack up her things and leave with her daughter. As for Michael, the weight of his sins finally caught up to him. With nowhere to turn, no power left to wield, he disappeared. Some said he fled to another country. Others believed he wandered into the wilderness, lost in his own shame. But one thing was certain, the mighty had fallen, and the truth had finally set everyone free.